An Indigenous group in Canada says it's discovered 751 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school.
Indigenous leaders are calling it a crime against humanity, the second such discovery in less than a month.
The Indigenous people from Canada, they always knew it was there. They said, you need to look to our neighbors to the south of us in the US.
Things like that happened here. Kind of want to brush it aside. Hopefully it stays buried. Hopefully it's not brought out in the open. That we've had those kinds of atrocities happen to us here in the United States.
I've talked to elders who tell me that all the children in the village had to leave. And there was an eerie quiet in the village. There was no sound of children.
The headmaster whipped my bare back with a rubber hose. I couldn't breathe, couldn't catch my breath. I passed out. Little boy said they had to hold me up for one more whip. Our stories need to be heard. This part of the United States history has to be told. The government said that it was becoming too expensive to continue killing Indians. Let's educate them. Let's assimilate them. He was a rabid assimilationist. So it was, let's kill the Indian in them and save the man. The whole basis for his boarding schools was to get them as far away from the culture as he could. Forced assimilation and forced Christianity, the work ethic in a complete military style format. No one had ever asked the federal government how many boarding schools they ran. No one ever asked the churches how many boarding schools they ran. So I decided to dedicate as much time as I could to research how many boarding schools were in the United States. Just recently, I've come up with 406. The buildings were cold, they were underheated, the kids were hungry, and they were half worked to death. The discipline was horrific. The kids were killed. They got killed working in the barn or working out in the fields. They were overcrowded. So they died of TB, measles. They died of typhoid, pneumonia, and the flu. I had a reporter ask me or say, well, the history of boarding school was written out of the books. And I said, well, it was never written in. It's not in any history books. My father was 9 years old and he was sent off to boarding school. This is Daddy right there. My interest in boarding school began listening to my father and my mother tell stories about their boarding school days. There isn't any Native person alive today that hasn't had someone that went to boarding school in their family.
The overwhelming thing that all matrons looked out for was to make sure that no child spoke their language. They had a thing called the gauntlet, and a child could rack up some demerits. Sometimes those demerits were for speaking your language. And during that gauntlet, children who had these demerits were forced to become completely undressed and walk and run naked down a line of children who were on both sides of them, using their belts against their fellow student. And sometimes some kids used the buckle end. Some of these kids hit pretty hard because if they didn't, they would have to go through the gauntlet. Another day, which will always be seared in my memory, is a friend of mine was knocked out. This grown man just took his fist and just hit the side of my friend's face so hard that it splayed his face open all the way under his ear. And his face just fell open. He was instantly unconscious. He was bleeding profusely. He was taken to the hospital. And for the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think he was a daily reminder that this matron could do anything he wanted to. Because this matron was never fired, never admonished, never went to jail. Besides the physical punishment, there was psychological abuse and, of course, sexual abuse. Wrangell seemed to attract pedophiles, and a lot of boys in the boys' dorm were sexually molested. Yeah, when I was about 10 years old, I had written home, and I was writing about some of the abuses I saw and experienced. And my mom didn't do anything with what I wrote her about, so I thought she didn't care. But what I learned when I was much older and she happened to remember was, she said, when I got your letter, there was large parts of your letter that was blacked out. I guess today we call that being redacted. So a lot of the things that I talked about, my mom could never have known about because it was just blacked out. That's when I was at Wrangell, right there. I was 13. At the end of the 10 years that I was in boarding school, I knew everything about the world, but I didn't know who I was.
What happened in boarding schools is a cultural genocide. After finding my dad's records, I just broke down and just sobbed and sobbed. To think of this 9-year-old boy ripped away from everything he knew. I decided as a professor that I wanted to do a qualitative interview study of boarding school survivors. There were themes that came out. Number one, of course, was loss of identity, loss of language, loss of culture, loss of ceremonies, traditions, self-esteem. There was extreme loneliness. There was loss of their parents and a sense of abandonment. Then there was abuse. There was corporal punishment, forced child labor. They were hungry, malnourished, and there was sexual and mental abuse. There was unresolved grief. The survivors I talked to, several of them had never told their children or their grandchildren. There was another elder that said, when do we tell our boarding school stories? Thanksgiving dinner? You know, do we say, oh, I was molested for 5 years by a priest at boarding school, you know, at a family dinner? So there's just this resounding silence of boarding school survivors. Because when do they tell their stories? What format? How? Who? No one's ever asked them. They can't talk about it. This one gentleman, he patted the back of his head and he said, my boarding school story will stay forever there. That intergenerational trauma has been handed down to even those that didn't go to boarding school.